Margaret Harper sat in her daughter's sunny kitchen, watching Emily fuss with a teapot that had belonged to Margaret's mother. At 58, Margaret had grown comfortable with her quiet life, her library volunteer work, her book club, her Sunday phone calls with old friends. The idea of dating felt like trying on clothes from another era. "Mom, please," Emily said, pouring chamomile tea into delicate china cups. "Just one coffee date. That's all I'm asking. David is wonderful. He's kind, he's thoughtful, and he's been alone for 5 years now, just like you." Margaret stirred honey into her tea, watching the golden swirls dissolve. "Sweetheart, I'm not sure I'm ready." "Your father." "It's been 8 years, I know, but I'm settled now. I have my routines, my peace." "And you're lonely," Emily said gently, reaching across the table to touch her mother's hand. "I see it, Mom, on holidays when everyone pairs off. On Sunday evenings when you think no one's watching. You have so much love left to give." Margaret felt her eyes grow warm with tears. Her daughter knew her too well. The truth was, the house felt too quiet sometimes. The bed felt too wide. And there were moments, watching couples walk hand in hand through the park, or seeing elderly husbands pushing their wives' wheelchairs through the grocery store, when Margaret felt an ache so profound it took her breath away. "One coffee," she finally said. "But no expectations, Emily. Promise me that." Emily's face lit up like sunrise. "No expectations. Just coffee and conversation. That's all." Romano's coffee house sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, a brick building with large windows that let the autumn sunlight pour across worn wooden floors. Margaret arrived 10 minutes early, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed open the heavy door. The scent of roasted coffee and cinnamon enveloped her immediately. She spotted him by the window. David Chen was exactly as Emily had described, late 50s, with distinguished salt and pepper hair that suggested he'd earned every gray strand through experience rather than worry. He wore a gray cardigan that looked soft and well-loved, layered over a simple black shirt. His profile was thoughtful as he gazed out the window, and Margaret noticed the slight sadness in his eyes even from across the room. Her first instinct was to turn around and leave. Her second was to walk forward anyway. "David?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He turned and his face transformed. Not with excessive enthusiasm or forced brightness, but with genuine warmth that reached his eyes and softened the lines around his mouth. "Margaret, thank you for coming. Please sit down." He stood as she approached, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that touched her. They settled into chairs across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, Margaret noticed. It was the silence of two people taking each other's measure, trying to find their footing. "I have to confess," David said, his voice low and gentle. "I almost canceled this morning. 3 times, actually. I stood in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, convinced I was too old, too set in my ways, too damaged perhaps for this kind of thing." Margaret laughed softly, relief flooding through her. "I did the same thing. I even got dressed twice. The first outfit seemed too eager, the second too casual. I finally settled on this and told myself I was meeting a friend, not going on a date." "Is that what this is?" David asked, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Meeting a friend?" "I think it's whatever we decide it is," Margaret replied. "No pressure. No expectations. Just 2 people sharing coffee on a Tuesday afternoon." "I like that," David said. He signaled the waitress, a young woman with kind eyes who seemed to know him. "The usual, please, Maria, and for you, Margaret. Earl Grey tea, if you have it, with a little honey." As Maria walked away, David leaned back in his chair. "Our kids conspired, you know. My son James works with your Emily. Apparently they've been planning this for months. James kept telling me about this wonderful woman, this retired librarian with the kindest heart and the sharpest wit. I thought he was exaggerating, but now I'm not so sure he was." Margaret felt warmth creep into her cheeks. Emily did the same. "Except she called you a gentleman in a world that's forgotten what that word means. She said you volunteer at the community center, teaching children to read." "Guilty as charged," David said. "It started as something to fill the time after my wife passed, but it became the best part of my week. Watching a child's face when the letters suddenly make sense. When the words click into place, there's no feeling quite like it. Their drinks arrived, along with a plate of butter cookies that Maria set between them without being asked. "On the house," she said with a knowing smile. "Thank you, Maria," David said warmly. Then to Margaret, "I come here often. It's become a bit of a refuge. The noise is just right, enough to feel alive, not enough to overwhelm. And Maria makes sure I don't sit alone too long." Margaret picked up her teacup, inhaling the familiar bergamot scent. "Tell me about your wife. If that's not too forward. I've found that people either want to talk about their lost loves or they don't. And there's no way to know which without asking." David's expression grew tender, touched with sadness but not overcome by it. "Her name was Linda. We were married for 32 years. She was a painter, watercolors mostly. Our house is still full of her work. Seascapes and garden scenes, all these soft, dreamy images that somehow captured exactly how she saw the world. Gentle, beautiful, full of light." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "She got sick 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 18 months from diagnosis to the end. 18 months of fighting and hoping and finally accepting. She made me promise I wouldn't stop living, that I'd find joy again, find companionship. I told her I would, but I didn't believe it. Until recently, I suppose." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "My husband Robert died suddenly. Heart attack in the middle of the night. One moment he was there snoring softly beside me. The next moment he was gone. No warning. No goodbyes. Just absence." She took a shaky breath. "For a long time I was angry about that. Angry that we didn't get those final conversations, those precious last words. But I've come to see it as a mercy, in its way. He didn't suffer. He didn't waste away. He just slipped from one world to the next while sleeping. I choose to believe that's a gift." David reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his palm. "I think it was," he said softly. "And I think he'd want you to be happy now. Just as Linda wanted that for me." They talked for 2 hours that first afternoon. About their children and grandchildren, about books they'd loved and movies that had moved them to tears, about the small rituals that had kept them anchored through grief, Margaret's morning walks, David's Saturday visits to the farmer's market, both of their habits of talking aloud to spouses who could no longer answer. When they finally stood to leave, the sun had shifted across the floor, painting everything in amber light. At the door, David turned to her. Would you be willing to do this again? Same time next week? Same table?" Margaret smiled, feeling something unfurl in her chest, something she'd thought was dead but was perhaps only sleeping. "I'd like that very much." Over the next month, Tuesday afternoons at Romano's became sacred time. Margaret found herself thinking about David throughout the week, about something funny he'd said, or a book he'd recommended, or the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. He was different from Robert in almost every way. Robert had been boisterous and social, filling rooms with his presence. David was quieter, more contemplative, but no less substantial. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight. On their fourth meeting, as they shared their usual plate of butter cookies, David mentioned his work almost casually. "I'm in management," he said. "Business operations, mostly. It pays the bills, keeps me busy." Margaret didn't think much of it. She'd spent 40 years as a librarian, living modestly but comfortably. She owned her small apartment, drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well, and had enough savings to feel secure. Money had never been what motivated her, and she appreciated that David seemed to share that perspective. "Do you enjoy it?" she asked. "Your work?" David considered the question carefully. "Parts of it. I like solving problems, building systems that help people, but the bureaucracy, the politics, those parts I could do without. Honestly, my real passion is the volunteer work. Tuesday evenings at the community center, I work with kids who are struggling to read. That feels more meaningful than anything I do in an office." "I understand that completely," Margaret said. "The best moments of my library career were the story hours. Watching children discover that books could transport them, transform them, that was the real magic." They began to expand beyond Tuesday coffee dates. David invited Margaret to join him for a walk through Patterson Park one Sunday morning. She suggested a concert at the community center, a string quartet performing Vivaldi. He asked if she'd like to visit the art museum's new exhibition on American landscape painters. Each outing felt natural, unhurried. They held hands for the first time during the park walk, when Margaret stumbled slightly on an uneven path and David reached out to steady her. Neither of them let go afterward. "Is this okay?" he asked softly, his fingers intertwined with hers. "It's more than okay," Margaret replied. "It feels right." Emily noticed the change in her mother immediately. "You're glowing, Mom," she said during one of their weekly dinners. "I haven't seen you this happy in years." Margaret couldn't deny it. She was happy, but underneath the happiness was a current of anxiety. She'd noticed small things about David that didn't quite add up. He drove a modest sedan, yes, but it was always impeccably maintained. His clothes were simple, but the quality was unmistakable once you looked closely. And once, when his phone rang during their coffee date, she'd glimpsed the caller ID. James, Chen Industries CEO. She'd pushed the observation aside, not wanting to complicate what felt beautifully uncomplicated. But the question lingered at the edges of her mind. 6 weeks into their relationship, David invited Margaret to dinner at his home. "Nothing fancy," he promised. "Just homemade pasta and a chance to show you Linda's paintings. If you're comfortable with that." Margaret's heart raced as she drove to the address David had given her. She'd expected a modest house in a comfortable neighborhood. Instead, her GPS led her to Rolling Hills Estates, where houses sat behind gates and sprawling lawns. She checked the address 3 times before pulling up to the iron gates. When she pressed the intercom, David's voice came through immediately. "Margaret? Come right in. Follow the drive to the main house." The gates swung open and Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The driveway curved through manicured gardens, past a fountain, before revealing a stunning contemporary home with floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly in the twilight. David stood at the front door, still wearing his familiar gray cardigan, looking nervous. "Before you say anything," he began as Margaret climbed out of her car, "please come inside. Let me explain." Margaret's mind was reeling, but she followed him into a foyer that opened onto a breathtaking living space. And there, covering nearly every wall, were Linda's paintings, dozens of soft, luminous watercolors that seemed to breathe life into the room. "They're beautiful," Margaret whispered. "They are," David agreed. "But that's not what I need to explain. Please sit down. I'll make us some tea." They settled in a cozy kitchen that somehow managed to feel intimate despite its size. David busied himself with the kettle, his back to Margaret as he spoke. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he said quietly. "Not about anything important. My feelings for you are completely genuine. But about my work, my circumstances. I let you believe I was just ordinary, middle management, getting by." He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'm the CEO of Chen Industries. We manufacture medical equipment, diagnostic machines, surgical tools, prosthetics. The company's been in my family for 40 years. My father built it from nothing, and I took over when he retired 15 years ago." Margaret sat very still, processing. "Why didn't you tell me?" David brought their tea to the table, sitting across from her just as he had that first day at Romano's. "Because every time I've tried to date since Linda died, the money changed things. Women saw the house, the company, the lifestyle, and suddenly I wasn't David anymore. I was a bank account, a retirement plan, a status symbol." He met her eyes, his own bright with unshed tears. "But with you, from that very first afternoon, I felt seen. Really seen. You asked about my volunteer work, my interests, the books I loved. You never once asked what I did for a living or where I lived or what kind of car I drove. You saw me, Margaret, just me. And I didn't want to lose that." Margaret absorbed his words, feeling her own emotions churn. Surprise, yes, but also understanding. And beneath it all, relief. "David," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something too. I've been holding back as well. Not about wealth. I'm a retired librarian who lives in a modest apartment and drives a 12-year-old Honda. But I've been afraid. Afraid that once you really knew me, knew how ordinary my life is, you might want something more sophisticated, someone who fit better into whatever world you inhabited. She laughed shakily. I thought maybe you were struggling financially. I saw your simple clothes, your older car, and I was relieved because it meant we were equals. It meant you wouldn't judge me for my small life. David reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. Margaret, do you know what I love about our Tuesday afternoons? What I treasure most? She shook her head, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. The cookies, he said, and she laughed despite herself. But seriously, the simplicity, the conversation, the way you listen. When I talk about the kids at the community center, the way your face lights up when you describe a book you've just finished, the way you hold your teacup with both hands, as if you're warming yourself from the inside out. He squeezed her hands gently. I have money, yes. More than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But I'd trade it all for what we have in that coffee shop. For someone who sees me as David, not as Chen Industries. For someone whose company makes me feel alive again. Margaret stood, moving around the table to wrap her arms around him. He held her tight, and they stayed that way for a long moment. Two people who'd each been afraid of being too much or not enough, discovering they were exactly right for each other. Part 5. Moving forward, they spent the evening cooking together, David teaching Margaret his mother's pasta recipe while she told him stories about the eccentric patrons who used to frequent her library. They ate dinner surrounded by Linda's paintings, and Margaret felt no jealousy, only gratitude that David had been loved so well and had loved so deeply in return. What happens now? Margaret asked as they sat on the back patio, watching the sun set over the gardens. David was quiet for a moment. I'd like to keep meeting at Romano's on Tuesdays, he said. I don't want that to change, but I also want to share this part of my life with you. The foundation work, I didn't mention that earlier, but I run a nonprofit that funds literacy programs. I'd love your expertise on that. And there are charity events, galas, things I've been attending alone for 5 years that would be so much better with you beside me. He turned to her, his expression earnest. But only if you want that. I don't need you to change anything about yourself or your life. If you're happy with Tuesday coffee dates and Sunday walks, that's enough for me. More than enough. Margaret thought about her small apartment, her simple routines. Then she thought about the way David's face lit up when he talked about the foundation, about the children whose lives could be changed by better literacy programs. She thought about Linda's paintings and David's gentle kindness and the unexpected joy she'd found in opening her heart again. I want to keep Romano's, she said firmly. That's our place, our beginning. But I want the rest too. I want to help with the foundation. I want to meet your son properly. I want to see where this goes, David, without fear or pretense. Just two people building something real. David smiled. The sadness that had always lingered in his eyes finally, fully receding. I want that too. They sat together as darkness fell, talking about practical matters, how to blend their lives, how to handle curious friends and family, how to navigate the differences in their circumstances without letting those differences define them. My apartment has rent control, Margaret said at one point, and they both laughed. I'm not giving that up lightly. I wouldn't dream of asking you to, David replied. Though I have to say, the commute from Rolling Hills to Romano's might get tiresome eventually. Are you asking me to move in with you? Margaret teased. Not yet, David said seriously. But someday, maybe, when we're both ready, when it feels as natural as everything else between us. Part 6. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of Romano's, watching through the window as David sat at their usual table, 2 cups already waiting. It was Tuesday afternoon, and despite everything that had changed, despite the foundation board she'd joined, despite the elegant fundraising gala they'd attended last month, despite the weekend they'd just spent at David's cabin in the mountains, this remained constant. Their table, their coffee and tea, their butter cookies. She pushed open the door, and David looked up, his face transforming with that same warmth she'd seen on their first meeting. Some things, Margaret thought with deep contentment, should never change. How was your morning? David asked as she settled into her chair. Beautiful, Margaret said. I had coffee with Emily. then stopped by the library to help with the children's reading program. And I've been thinking, about? Margaret smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. About the future. About how sometimes the best gifts come in the simplest wrapping. About how wealth isn't measured in bank accounts but in moments like these, Tuesday afternoons with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves what they find. David's eyes grew bright. I've been thinking similar thoughts. About how I spent 5 years believing my story was over. About how wrong I was. About how the woman I almost didn't meet because I was too scared has become the best part of my everyday. Maria appeared with fresh coffee and tea, setting down an extra-large plate of butter cookies. "You too," she said affectionately. "You give the rest of us hope." As she walked away, Margaret and David looked at each other and laughed. The easy, comfortable laughter of two people who'd found their way home. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the windows. Inside, two hearts that had thought themselves finished discovered they were just beginning. And on the table between them, a plate of simple butter cookies represented everything that mattered. Kindness, connection, and the courage to show up as exactly who you are. Sometimes that's more than enough. Sometimes that's everything.